All right, I want to talk about effective communication for just a couple of minutes, just to kind of remind you of some things we talked about last semester and highlight them for this first case study that we're going to be looking at. First of all, I think it's important just to remind you something about organizational communication. It is really true that no organization has employees that are completely happy with the communication that exists within the organization. It is really a given that communicating within organizations is hard. Communication is one of the toughest issues in organization. It's one of the issues that is most frequently complained about, especially when you're talking about organizational change. I should say, in an aside, interestingly enough also, oftentimes managers and leaders aren't aware of the key role that the communication is playing in causing this kind of discontent. We take communication in organizations for granted. Therefore, if we're going to have effective communication in organizations, right, we have to have four components all working well. These are four components that I talked about last semester that you can use to identify types of organizational communication structures. They are also the components of effective organization. That is the channel of the communication, the content or message of the communication, the style of that message, and the flow of the communication. So I want to just briefly review those four things for you. All right, the content of the message. What should actually be in a communication? Again, we tend to just take for granted we know what we want to say to our employees without thinking and planning ahead. The content of the message has to resonate, and connect with the already held belief of the employee or the receiver. What do I mean by that? What I mean is you've got to think about the person you're sending that message to in an organization and how you can connect with something that they understand about the issue or the organization, right? I'm not talking necessarily about outside of the organization, but you have to reach out in the message, right, and make it clear to them what that you are saying has relevance to the employee. It has to contain information that the employee wants to hear. In other words, you have to think about what you are saying at the level that the employee would be interested in and makes sense to them. And it should answer the employee's what we call most cherished and most cared about questions. You have to come around to the employee by reaching the employee where they are at and with what they value. So the content of the message, the actual topic and information that you're going to give them needs to be thought through before you ever start speaking or writing that message. What about the channel? We talked a lot last semester about what makes a channel rich, how you choose the richest quote-unquote channel for the appropriate message, right? Media richness is a topic that I feel very strongly about, understanding the channel before you choose it. You must choose a channel that suits the circumstance and the needs of the sender and the receiver. What does that mean? It means that an organization has to make sure that both the sender and the receiver understand the use of a specific channel. So having access to email on a timely basis, understanding how to use a Zoom meeting, understanding what the purposes of a written, for example, notice. All of those things may seem really obvious, but they're not. Sorry, that was my heater going on. Finally, the choice of the channel should be deliberate and not for expediency. In other words, just because it's easy to send an email off doesn't mean that it's the right channel. And just because it's difficult to put together a presentation for a group doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. And in fact, I think one of the things that people most take for granted is when they come into a meeting unprepared for what they want to cover in the meeting. That meeting is a channel. Okay, the style of the message. That is, so you know the general content, the topic, what you want to cover in whatever channel you're using for whatever message, but what's the style going to be? Right? The individual who's sending the message has to present the message clearly and in detail and in a way that radiates integrity and authenticity. So we've talked about this in terms of how do you start an email? How do you start a meeting? Right? What's the language that you're going to use? Think of it almost as if you're walking into a meeting and everybody there speaks French. So you're going to have to speak French. In a sense, the way you choose your words, the way you order your ideas are a way of using a language that reaches out to the receivers because you're showing them you understand where they're at. You go back to what makes a message important, right? It meets the sender's needs and it meets the receiver's needs. So the person receiving the message also has a responsibility, right? They have to listen, they have to ask questions if they need to for clarity, and they have to trust the sender of the message. That is tough in organizations. You have to build that trust. The sender has to care that the receiver trusts them, and that is not always a given in an organization. And likewise, the receiver of the message has to be willing to pay attention to the message. And that's a big issue, right? Both in an online meeting or in an email or a text, you have no control as the sender as to how the receiver is receiving that. So you're trying to set up, you as the person in the middle, the sort of agreement of how people are going to send and receive these messages. What that comes down to is that fourth component of the flow. And actually, if you remember the class where we talked about informal communication and the whole who talks to whom, that flow of communication creates very important networks in organizations. And what you're trying to do with messages is create what we call the strongest flow with the best symmetry. What do we mean by strongest flow, right? That is choosing the right amount of content and sending that message at the right time, right? And communicating the right level of importance. So, for example, if you have sort of a minor message, right, that you want to let people know that the meeting time has been changed, and you send off a dramatic email, right, you are making that message way more important than it has to be. And the next time you send a message that really is important, people may not listen to it. Same thing is true in the way you approach people verbally, right, and how you come across. You have to be aware of how strong a message you're sending, right, for the importance of that particular message. And the symmetry is that interesting piece of the network, right? What's the direction of the flow and the back and forth? And again, if the leader, if the person who is reaching out is the only one sending the message and not being receptive to something coming back, that sets up a particular dynamic and a particular role for each other, right? The same status, right? Having the same status, you assume the same status means, well, we are at the same formal status in the organization. But what it really means is how, for this message, do you create a similar status? Let the person you're sending the message to know that they can write back or they can respond with questions, right? And the same strength. How do you give permission for the person coming back to share the same importance and amount that you gave out? So this is a complex issue, this flow of the communication and the message. And all of this is not something that we do automatically. And it's not something that we spend a lot of time. Every time you send an email, you're not going to spend hours thinking about these things. But the more you kind of use these four components and think about these four components, the more they will sort of become automatically part of every message that you send, every meeting that you're organizing, or every email that you're sending out. So just being aware of these four things helps improve the communication. All right, so I had you read these 2 case studies. 4 of you read the case study about Third Bank with Kathy Fuller starting a new job in a new branch, right? And the other one was Helping Others nonprofit with this woman, Eileen Ramsey, coming on the board and being asked to kind of look at the personnel issues in the organization. And what I'm setting up is, you've read these, hopefully you've read them, you're going to move into your groups and think about and assume that these leads in these cases, Kathy and Eileen, have asked for your analysis of their situation, either as the external consultant or the internal HR person with expertise in change. They want to know what they have done that was effective communication and what they could do to be more effective going forward. So these case studies both give you positive things that have occurred as far as organizational communication and opens up the possibilities for what could happen going forward to make the communication more effective.